Alright guys, how's it going? I hope you're doing very well. Now I'm going to try and save you a little bit of money here, especially when you're using a render farm. Now this can be any render farm. The principles are generally the same. The best piece of advice I can honestly give is plan your scene. Now what do I mean by this? This sounds so obvious. First thing is, know exactly how many frames you need to render. Never render extra. You don't need to render extra, so if you've got frames here and here, we don't need them. Another thing is, we might have a hold keyframe on frame 100, let's say for example. Nothing moves, everything's static, and it might start up again in 140. So that's 40 dead frames. We don't need these 40 frames. We can do this in comp. Now, if you've got motion blur, or maybe your camera's moving, or there's something swaying in the wind or whatever, yeah, well then you need it. But if you have a hold keyframe and it just holds, delete them, break the scene up into different scenes. So break it from 100 and start it up from 140. I know it sounds trivial, but 20 frames can cost you a lot of money, especially if you're working on larger projects. Another piece of advice I can give is only render what you see. So what do I mean by this? And this was actually taught by a good friend called Larry Schultz. And he's old school, he came from the 90s. So for rendering the default cube, what I've seen people do is have hundreds and hundreds of polygons in the background that the camera will never ever see. Not even shadows, not even for reflections, they just don't appear in the camera. You don't need that geometry, get rid of it, delete it. There's no need for it. All it does is add more time to your render time. So, best piece of advice, get rid of as much geo as you possibly can. Now, on that, let's move over to textures. So we've got this beautiful mountain, and we've got this lake, and we've got these high polygon trees here. Look at this scene, beautiful. We've got depth of field enabled, we're zooming in on the cube here, and this mountain is blur. Now what I've seen is people do 8K mountains. There's no need for that texture resolution to be that high, especially when it gets thrown out by the depth of field. It becomes a blur. So you don't need to have an 8K texture. So best tip is reduce your texture sizes. If they're not close to the camera, bring them down. And this includes normal maps, displacement maps, texture maps, or diffuse maps, whatever you want to call them. Reduce them. You could probably reduce this down to 1K. In fact, you could probably go lower in all honesty. But just in case you need that little bit of fidelity, drop it down. Now it's different if your camera's moving in the scene and you want to actually zoom into these mountains. But what you can do is an LOD switch as well, so you can actually switch the level of detail. And this takes me on to my next point, and it's regarding polygon count. Now I see this quite a lot. So we have this nice tree here, and it might be a high polygon, it might even be a million polygons, right? Which is fine. What a lot of people do is they'll instance in the background with these million polygon objects, and then they'll send that off and not care about it. Don't do that. You don't need to do that. Especially if your depth of field or whatever's here as well. Just reduce it. You could make even something like a plane with an image on it, or you can reduce the polygon count if possible. Don't always throw geometry at the scene. And this is what I mean by plan your scene. Think about what your shot's going to be. So textures and polygons, always try and reduce them as much as possible. Another thing we want to do is try and reduce the file size. Now there's several ways we can do this, especially in Blender. If we go to file, we can go to cleanup and we can purge unused data. So this gets rid of all the junk materials, anything that we don't use, textures, geometry, anything like that. It gets rid of it from the Blender file. We don't need it. So when we go to send this to a farm, the file size is a lot more optimized. Another thing we can also do is when we go to save, if we go to file and go to save, we can come up to the cog here and we can actually compress the .blend, and this makes the Blender file a lot more optimized. I think it's like a zip format essentially. So that's a few ways we can do it. Another quick tip is, let me just quickly open this scene up here, rendered this beautiful animation, and the client turns around and says, look, I want the hair to be blue, and you're like, oh my god. Now this will happen, it will happen all the time. I don't want to render out this whole scene, it was quite heavy. What we can do is use something like render region. So if we actually go to view, we can go to view regions and we can render region. And we can select what we want to render. And inside of After Effects, DaVinci, whatever you want to use, we can just overlay this on top. Now it's not always going to work, but what I'm only doing here is I'm only rendering this part here. I'm not rendering the rest of the scene. and that'll start to optimize it. It should be a lot quicker, and all you do is drop it in comp. So hopefully that'll give you a few ideas. Like I says, the most important one is plan your scene. Anyway, any questions, stick them down below. Thanks for watching.